Hello, this is John Tennison speaking, the producer of the documentary The Place That Forgot It Existed, a Texarkana Reckoning. I'm making a featurette, actually the first featurette that I have made for this documentary, because I wanted to share the process by which I discovered who I think is the most likely person to have been the German piano teacher of Scott Joplin. I did not want to wait any longer to make this because I wanted to call it to the attention of other Joplin scholars, such as Ed Berlin and Bill Edwards and many others, who are understandably very interested in that question. Consequently, I didn't want to delay the possibility that any of them might find or discover things that I had not. And I also wanted to put my theory under the scrutiny of others to see if it held up. So this is a very casual and very informal featurette, but it describes that process of how I came to believe that a man named Paul Friensehner is the most likely person to have been Scott Joplin's German piano teacher. So let me start with a few things, some of which you might have already seen. As you can see here, this is a map of different colored areas of Texarkana taken from one of the Sanborn index pages. This is the lower resolution map. And I had done a video in the past prior to producing the documentary in which I talked about the location that I thought was most probably where the Joplins were living, or my best estimate for where they were living in 1880. I have since gone back and filled in more detail to this map. So if we start with this first little pointer here, the block you see pointed out with the white dot on it is, for the reasons previously described, the area that I think is the most likely block on which the Joplins were living when they were still on the Texas side of Texarkana as of the 1880 census. And the next you can see at some point in time, Scott Joplin came to be living at this other address, 618 Hazel, which is where his mother lived and where he probably resided for most of the time after his mother moved to the Arkansas side. And that, as you can see, is on between the 7th and 6th Street of Hazel on the east side of the street, 618 Hazel. Next, I have labeled the address of 816 Wood. This is the house where the African-American music teacher John C. Johnson resided. He has also been reported to have been one of Joplin's teachers, and he also had a very prominent role. He was a band leader in Texarkana. Okay, here is 831 Laurel Street. This is the address of what's known as the Orr School. Currently, a structure still stands there. Many people believe that the structure that exists here at 831 Laurel is the first floor of a school where Joplin himself attended. Based on the evidence I have found, this is not a building that Joplin would have been attending school in through his high school age. However, he very likely did visit this structure when he came back to visit in Texarkana in 1907. Here is 606 Hazel, home of Zenobia Campbell, who was interviewed by researchers in 1959. Here is 809 Laurel, where music teacher Maggie Washington resided. Here is 521 Hazel, and this is the address of the Cook House, where Gene Cook, in a 1959 interview in Texarkana, said Scott Joplin played the piano while his mother cleaned the house. This is the origin of that idea of Scott Joplin's mother cleaning a house while he played the piano in the house. Here's another name that is present in the 1899 directory of Texarkana, and that's the name of John Climp, who lived at 514 East 4th Street. He conceivably could have been a piano teacher of Scott Joplin, but seems less likely than Paul Friensehner or Julius Weiss to have been in Texarkana at the right time. Okay, here is the Rogers house at 221 Maple, where Julius Weiss and also another man, Joseph Deutschmann, were boarders. This is the house that in the 1970s, Theodore Albrecht started theorizing about as possibly being a house where Scott Joplin's mother worked for the Rogers family. There's absolutely no evidence of that, In fact, that consideration only became necessary to support the theory that Julius Weiss was Scott Joplin's piano teacher. Moreover, the only reason that Julius Weiss was being most strongly considered by Theodor Albrecht as Scott Joplin's piano teacher was the fact that Theodor Albrecht only discovered 4 people who were listed as musicians in the 1880 census, and Julius Weiss was of German origin. So Theodor Albrecht started theorizing how Julius Weiss and Scott Joplin could have come to know about each other. Part of that theory involved the additional theory that Scott Joplin's mother worked for the Rogers family. However, there's no evidence that she ever did work for the Rogers family. And I think when you look at the evidence for Paul Friensehner, you're going to see that for all the reasons that Julius Weiss became a strong candidate, Paul Friensehner is an even stronger candidate. Okay, here's another interesting address. This is 709 Hazel. This is the Wilder house from which the so-called Joplin piano at the museum in Texarkana was acquired in 1985. There's no evidence that Joplin played this piano or that his mother worked at that house. In similar fashion to the claim of Gene Cook in 1959 about the house at 521 Hazel, it's quite plausible that Miss Joplin had the same arrangement if she were an employee at the Wilder house at 709 Hazel. But we just don't know. Okay, now we're getting into Paul Friensehner. I give 2 different addresses because at different points in time, the same location has 2 different addresses, either 502 or 407. But this is Paul Friensehner's bronze and jewelry factory. It also appears, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, that he most likely, his residence was most likely directly beside that factory in 1880. So he probably lived directly beside the factory on Broad Street. Paul Friensehner had been in Texarkana since at least 1879 when his son Augustus was born there. He might have been there before that. But part of Theodor Albrecht's analysis regarding the name of Julius Weiss was to look at people who were present in the 1880 census in Texarkana. And certainly it's the case that both Paul Friensehner and Julius Weiss were present in Texarkana on the 1880 census. And in the case of Paul Friensehner, he was there at least a year earlier and maybe prior to 1879. I'm still looking into that question. Okay. What really convinced me that Paul Friensehner was the most likely candidate to have been Scott Joplin's piano teacher was the discovery of Paul Friensehner's name as a professor of music and teacher of piano in an educational institution that was directly across the street from where Joplin was living once the family moved to the Arkansas side. And that was the location of 615 Hazel Street. In the process of researching early schools in Texarkana for the purpose of the documentary, Eddie Schofield shared a pamphlet with me from the Texarkana Seminary. This pamphlet was from one of the oldest schools in Texarkana, if not the oldest school in Texarkana, that had evolved and changed over time. It was run by a woman by the last name of Gaither, and among her faculty was Paul Friensehner as a music professor and teacher of piano. This was an additional role, of course, for Paul Friensehner beyond that of having a bronze and jewelry factory and being a locksmith and a gunsmith and just a Renaissance man by any measure. And so when Eddie showed me this pamphlet and I saw the name Paul Friensehner and I saw that he was a music professor, I was amazed. At that point, I did not yet know where this school was located, but I knew immediately when I saw that name, and I knew that I'd seen the name Friensehner before, that it immediately occurred to me that, this guy should at least be considered for having possibly been the German piano teacher of Scott Joplin. The reason that Theodor Albrecht did not discover Paul Friensehner in the 1880 census is that Paul Friensehner's profession was listed as jeweler. So he was not discoverable as a musician based on the census alone. That information only came from other sources. Once I saw the pamphlet from the school, which I'm going to show you in a moment, I started looking at old newspapers, and it was clear that Paul Friensehner was a musician. I haven't said anything about the Texarkana College and Conservatory of Music. This is a fascinating institution as well, but it did not come along until the mid-1890s, so it's a little bit late to have been the institution where Scott Joplin would have had a German piano teacher. But indeed, they had German piano teachers and professors there as well. It just came along a little later, and therefore it was not around until the mid-1890s, and therefore would not have been relevant to consider as of 1880. But let me just say a few words about the Texarkana College and Conservatory of Music now that I have it on the screen. As far as I know, it's the first institution that was actually called the Texarkana College prior to the current Texarkana College that we all know. And it was at I would say, a very venerable address, and which has been numbered differently over the years, even though it's the same location, either 206, 220, or 222 Vine. And the reason I say venerable is because originally the structure at that address was a U.S. courthouse. And then later it became the location of the YMCA before the YMCA moved down closer to the railroad tracks. And after that, it became the Elks Lodge. And most of us in the 20th century, before the building was torn down, remember it as having been the Elks Lodge. But as the Elks Lodge, in 1915, one of the most famous historic speeches ever given in Texarkana was delivered by Miriam Fort Gill at that location in 1915, in which she called attention to her grandfather, Josiah Fort, the father of Texarkana, and said that he had coined the word Texarkana and had placed a sign in the ground with that name, Texarkana, in 1849. Later, on December 6, 1856, Texarkana was formally created. This is a screen from the 1888 aerial map of Texarkana, which is hand-drawn, probably from the vantage point of a hot air balloon. But in this particular detail from that map, you can see Paul Friensehner's factory in 1888, pointed out by this balloon. And you can also see the structure just to the west of that, immediately adjacent to that, which is probably his house. That's probably the structure he was living in. And in 1885, that is shown as being a dwelling. You can see that this factory and dwelling existed on Broad Street between Oak and Spruce. I would now like to show you the actual pamphlet that Eddie Sheffield located and showed me in the process of my researching early education institutions in Texarkana. Here you can see the front cover of the pamphlet that Eddie Sheffield shared with me. This is for the Texarkana Seminary during their session of 1891-92. One thing that not everyone might know is that these days when we hear the word seminary, we think of a religious institution, but the word seminary also referred to a school for girls and children. I'm currently searching for any Texarkana Seminary announcements prior to 1891 and 92. As I will show you in a moment from this pamphlet from the Texarkana Seminary, this institution was one of the first, if not the first, educational institution in Texarkana. If you move on to the next page, there's a list of the directors. All of these were very prominent names in Texarkana. You can see the name Cook, which was the family at 521 Hazel, where Joplin reportedly played the piano while his mother worked. And the other names there are important early Texarkanians for various other reasons. On the next page, you can see the faculty listed. Miss Gaither, the principal. It was often called the Gaither School. And below her, there are other faculty who are mentioned. In particular, you see prominently right in the middle, Professor Paul Friensehner. And under his name, the description of his instruction, vocal music by the system of Pestalozzi as taught at the Academy of Music, Boston, Massachusetts. Thorough bass, harmony, composition, instrumental music, violin, mandolin, piano, guitar, and banjo. The next page is an advertisement from the American Book Company. The next page begins describing the course of study at the Texarkana Seminary. At the very bottom of this page, you see that music and art are included. The next two pages begin a more detailed description of those academic categories. On this page, you see a more detailed description of the music and art instruction. The first line describes this program as being a conservatory course in music. The next page describes requirements pertaining to study hours. The next page contains an appeal to Texar Canyons, in which the pamphlet states, "We respectfully ask of the public consideration of our claims to home patronage and the superior advantages placed at their very doors." There's also something interesting here that was very confusing until I clarified further. If you look down the third paragraph under Texarkana, it says, "The seminary is centrally located on State Line Avenue, only 2 blocks from the federal building." I had the hardest time finding where that address could have been until ultimately I found in a newspaper in Texarkana that the address was actually 615 Hazel Street. Even though that was not technically on State Line Avenue, it was being described as being on State Line Avenue. And it was still very close to the federal building, but not technically on State Line Avenue. Interestingly, in the very last paragraph, it states, quote, "There are 3 large free schools, 4 banks, a Baptist college, an academy, a practical business college, untold enterprise, pushing energy, and the future educational center of this section." By the way, the Baptist college that it mentions in that paragraph is the college that shortly afterwards became Interstate College, but that is the College of College Hill. It was known as Southwestern College at that time. On page 10, I would like to call your attention to the summary paragraph at the bottom of the page. It states, quote, "Texarkana Seminary has grown from a small day school to a day and boarding school. We can say the methods of instruction and discipline in use in this school are not only acceptable and popular, but beneficial to the community. It stands strictly on its merits and is the oldest school in the city. The institution is an enterprise in which every good citizen of the city feels great interest. It is the pioneer school of its kind in this section and has chemical apparatus, maps, charts, etc., etc. Liberal discounts given to daughters of clergymen of all denominations." At the time when I first saw this pamphlet, I did not know where the school was located. Upon later determining that the campus for this seminary was at 615 Hazel Street, directly across the street from where Scott Joplin was living, it was one of those experiences of something being right under your nose. The probability of Friensehner and Joplin learning about each other seemed substantially greater than the probability of Julius Weiss and Scott Joplin learning about each other. One last thing I want to show you in this featurette is an 1885 Sanborn map. I have spliced 2 of these 1885 maps together because I wanted to show you where Paul Friensehner's bronze and jewelry factory was located relative to the Benefield Hotel. So if you look at this map, you see the central road running right through the middle from east to west is Broad Street. You can see State Line Avenue on the right side of the map where Broad Street meets State Line Avenue, and if you continue eastward, you would enter Arkansas. If you look at the intersection of Maple and Broad, you can see the Benefield Hotel on the northeast corner of that intersection. That was also the location of the Benefield Hotel in 1880, and also even in the famous 1874 Townwell photo. Later, the Benefield Hotel moved across Maple Street to assume the location of the northwest corner of this same intersection. But the reason I'm pointing it out here is because I wanted to show you where that Benefield Hotel was relative to Paul Friensehner's bronze and jewelry factory. If you go westward on Broad Street down to the intersection of Spruce and Broad and look at the southwest corner, and then you can see written vertically, if you kind of turn your head to the right, it says Paul Friensehner's bronze and jewelry factory. And then if you look just west of that, you see a pink or brick structure as well as some dwellings, abbreviated DWG, around that. The peak structure there of his which is the factory itself, is 502 Broad Street. That's the address as of 1885. And then directly beside that is a dwelling, which is 503 Broad Street. And behind the factory, there's a single address, two separate structures, but one address of 502.5 Broad Street. So those are also listed as dwellings. So basically, you have the factory, and then you have three separate structures, each of which a dwelling, two of which are assumed under the same address. I point all of that out because if you look at the 1880 census, you will see the Benefield family living in a particular dwelling or structure, and I have confirmed that that is the Benefield Hotel. And that same census from 1880 shows that Paul Friensehner was living two structures away from the Benefield Hotel. Therefore, I believe that the census taker had first enumerated those living in the Benefield Hotel and then walked westward on Broad Street until they reached Paul Friensehner's complex. And they probably, if the structures were similar in 1880, they probably documented who was living in the 502.5 dwelling behind the factory, and then they probably went up to the 503 dwelling, which was where presumably Paul Friensehner himself was living. And that would have accounted for his dwelling as being shown two structures away, or two dwellings away from the Benefield Hotel, where the Benefield family was living. So anyway, that's about all I wanted to discuss in this very informal featurette. The one other thing I'll say just of interest is that if you go back to the intersection of Maple and Broad, you'll see that there is a public well right in the middle of that intersection. And if you look at the intersections to the east of that, there's another public well at State and Broad, and another public well just after the border, actually on the Arkansas side, still in the middle of Broad Street, kind of at Pine and Broad, but near State, right beside State line as well. But if you go back to the well that's at Maple and Broad, that is the exact location of the well that you see in the famous 1874 town well photo, in which the photographer would have been standing just to the west of that well, but looking eastward down Broad Street towards the state line. And that's where that famous 1874 photo was taken. Not only that, the young girl who's standing in front of the well in that well-known photograph is none other than Alice Benefield, who was living at the hotel there at the same corner, the Benefield Hotel. So I hope that not only scholars of Scott Joplin, but the public in general will find all of this to be interesting. It's been a great journey, and I want to thank Eddie Sheffield immensely, whose archival instincts and willingness to share and discuss his archives resulted in me seeing the flyer for the Texar Seminary, which in turn resulted in me seeing the name Paul Friensehner listed as a piano teacher rather than a jeweler or a locksmith or a gunsmith. And subsequently, through researching newspapers, seeing that educational institution was directly across the street from Scott Joplin, and also knowing that Paul Friensehner had been a prominent citizen in Texarkana since at least 1879, gave me great confidence that Paul Friensehner is the best candidate as having been the German piano teacher of Scott Joplin in Texarkana.